We pull up a pre-recorded segment from one of Pasco's interviews with Kim about pipes, which matches the description from the audience members that called in about the figure that they'd seen. So she's starting to think that maybe Kim is at the center of the haunting. But no time for that. Things are picking up. First with the sound of cats, and then Kim saying that Suzanne is in some kind of trance. Her face is all covered in scratches, and the room is cold, and yet she is burning up. And when Parkinson suggests that she could have just scratched herself, we see that her fingernails have been cut ridiculously short. I mean, like, you're never going to be able to pull apart two stubborn Legos again kind of short. A call comes in now telling about an old story along the lines of go to bed or this or that boogeyman will get you. Because there was this woman who was a baby farmer who would then drown the babies. Don't know how she got much repeat business, but anyway, she lived in this area. Parkinson wants Sarah's view on this, but the focus right now is on a resistant Kim who refuses to leave the house because Pipes doesn't want them to. Sarah insists that she and the crew will stay, though, because the girls want everyone to know about Pipes. And I think they've certainly done that. Calls are coming in about inexplicable things happening, many involving pets, but Parkinson brushes them all off. He's far more interested in what they're seeing at the house, not listening to every single crank in Britain. I mean, we'd be here for months otherwise. Back at the house, the girls refuse to be removed, and we're getting audio and video problems, plus more banging. Pipes is big on the banging. Find a central theme and build off it. That's what a good haunting needs. Kim is missing, so it could be one of the kids that's doing the banging. Eventually, after a panicked look, they do find her. She's in the kitchen in the dark behind the refrigerator door. But after finding her, we hear the cats some more.
It's in here. It's in the glory hole.
That's strange. You normally don't associate a glory hole with pussy. Sarah and Sound Guy decide to open it, so they pull the wood off and the door swings open. And we very briefly see part of a figure inside before Sound Guy, who had a good view of the inside, collapses. At first I'd thought he'd fainted, but it looks like the mirror shattered and hit him with shards in the back of his head. Then there's the sound of Suzanne, but we don't know where she is, and after checking the other cameras, the feed goes dead. They finally cut to some footage of Craig Charles cracking jokes with Egon here, which does a couple of things. On the one hand, it lightens the mood after the intensity of what we've just witnessed, but it also keeps the viewer riveted to the program, wanting desperately to know what's going on in the house, and this goofing off is getting in the way of that. We finally do get a look inside, and everything appears to be normal, which it shouldn't. As I've mentioned as recently as 3 days ago, I'm frequently obsessed with stupid shit. And so earlier my attention had been drawn to a 1-liter bottle of Coca-Cola on the hutch. Don't ask me to explain my neuroses. Anyway, that's how I know that that bottle had already been opened and partially used, and yet we are now seeing Suzanne open the bottle to pour the contents. So this isn't live anymore. This is footage from before. I mean, yeah, technically it could be a different bottle, but really, after all that we have just seen, what parent says, this situation calls for my kids to have sugar and caffeine? A call comes in with some more information on the house. Pasco says, and it doesn't matter, we know all about this stuff going all the way back, everything about this site. But the caller says there's one thing she doesn't know. The owners back in the 60s illegally sublet a room. And for that reason, there'd be no record of one tenant, Raymond Tunzel, who was an extremely disturbed child molester. This guy only knows about it because he was a social worker at the time, and Raymond told him that a woman took over his body and made him do things. In the end, because he couldn't handle it anymore, Raymond strangled himself. He tied a wire around his neck and then attached it to a lathe that he kept stored in the standrel. It was 12 days before his body was discovered, and the man's many, many cats were trapped in there with nothing but his corpse to eat. And this is why I say we definitely should ban woodworking tools. Parkinson has had enough. He's convinced there's been nothing but crank calls all night, but Pasco seizes upon this. Basically, that were nesting eldritch forces here. Randall, driven to suicide by the baby killer, who was driven to do what she did for who knows what reason, and who knows how far back it goes. She also notices that the footage is not live, and soon we see what's actually happening there. Strange voices and screeching, more incorrect footage being shown, and then a wind starts blowing through their own studio somehow, convincing Pascoe that they have unwittingly, by broadcasting this live like this, created a massive nationwide seance. This would have really come in handy during the London Blitz. That has scared the Nazis off. At the house, the police arrive and collect Pam and Kim. Sound guy has been picked up by an ambulance. But Sarah is still inside, picked up by the camera in infrared. They're using it to try to find Suzanne. This is a great means of upping the tension on it, as we can see Sarah, but very little else. When they finally do get the light on, there's a powerful wind, and things are going nuts back in the studio too. And while Sarah goes into the spandrel to try to save Suzanne, and is immediately locked in, things get even worse back in the studio. Lights blowing out, the sound of cats is everywhere. People start evacuating, and in the end, it's just Parkinson stumbling around in the near dark trying to figure out what to do next. He notices the unmanned camera that is still broadcasting him, but is confused. The auto cue is just saying nonsense.
Like a teddy bear.
Didn't believe that story about Mother Sadness. Did you?
Some of the people who worked at the Blair Witch Project media campaign look back with regret on what they did, because they feel like they were among the first to contribute to the idea of deliberately presenting fake news without indication that it's fake. In a similar vein, other works after Ghostwatch that presented what they knew to be false as true, like Alien Autopsy, or deliberately sensationalized things like Conspiracy Theory, Did We Land on the Moon, or Biggest Secrets of Magic Revealed, or, well, anything hosted by Mitch Pileggi, really, contributed to viewer attitudes becoming more jaded over time. As a result, people argue that they just wouldn't buy into it today they did back then. But the big argument at the time, and the reason why the show got more than 30,000 complaints, was they felt the BBC broke the unwritten rule that they could be trusted by the audience. Which tells me that if people are more jaded, it's because they no longer have the same faith that media is being presented in such a way that trust should be assumed, rather than just about television in general. Ghostwatch was actually supposed to be a 6-episode miniseries, but the Beeb wanted to shorten it to just one, and so it was decided, if we're going to do just one, then let's do the last one, because it's really the payoff for everything else. And if we're going to do that, then let's go all in and really make it look like the real deal. In that regard, I admire the program primarily for the artistry of it. The way they worked it very carefully, as I said, to draw you along, so that your reason to believe it wasn't being challenged too much. There are only 2 real problems that I have with it. First, without the 5 previous episodes, I have no reason to embrace Dr. Pascoe as an expert. It is indeed only my respect for the Ghostbusters that I don't act like Walter Peck and refuse to acknowledge her fictional degree. Instead, though, I find her to be this smug seller of snake oil, who it turns out just happens to be right, despite obviously being full of shit. The other is that, because it's about building slowly and gradually, it's just not interesting in many parts of it. Not dull, but not particularly engaging. In some of the reviews, I basically watched the show by making myself watch 5 minutes and then giving myself a short mental break so I can avoid drifting off, so I can actually pay attention to it because it's necessary. How else am I going to notice things like a half-empty liter of soda? This happened for the first half of the broadcast of this episode, but then when I got to the second half, I watched it almost in one full sitting. I did stop about 2/3 of the way through and came back to it later, but the point is, it traveled a lot better once we got past a lot of the build-up. So again, my appreciation of this is more of what they chose to do and how they chose to go about it. And I want to emphasize that's not nothing, because they didn't botch the idea. They didn't undermine what they were trying to do here, which could have easily been done. They could have given in to excesses, and they didn't. They played it just right as far as presenting the seriousness of the supernatural that they were showing to be real in all of this. As a result, they got us to where we needed to be to really truly believe what was happening at the end there. What makes this so effective is the fact that you watch certain things in different ways. When you're watching a realistic film or television show, you are nevertheless engaging in suspension of disbelief that has to allow you to go into the secondary world that I referred to earlier and to accept it as real. But you're still watching it in a different way than when you're watching something which you know is real, or at least would normally know as real. There's a very different sense between seeing someone shot when it's in a film, no matter how real, than seeing someone shot on the news. This is very likely the reason why I had such a negative view of Dr. Pascoe, because even though I know it's fiction, it's being presented so well in a way that says you're watching actual reality that they blur for me. Even though one part of me is saying that is an actor, the other part of me is saying this is one of those pricks who goes on TV and tries to sell their book with their snake oil. And I could not get past that image. But it speaks to how well that this was working by the fact that I despised her so much. Because it meant that even knowing it's fiction, I did, on some level, still perceive the events as if this was actually happening. So again, I have to applaud the artistry of this, if nothing else. I'm not going to say that it scared me, really, but nevertheless, I thoroughly enjoy the very concept of what they're doing with it.